what we're going to be going over is just an overview of budgeting for cost improvements or cost reductions. So when we're talking about budgets here, they can incorporate continuous improvements during the budgeting period, such as Kaizen Budgeting Method here. And this is where the budget includes cost reduction activities. Really, you're looking at small improvements here. So typically when you're working with, starting out with your master budget here, where you have to develop your operating budget here and your financial budget, you're really looking at the case here where your sales prices are fixed, your variable costs would be fixed, and your fixed cost obviously would be fixed, and really your sales mixes would be the same or constant here. So when we're dealing with budgeting and improvements, things change here. So when we're talking about our budgeted cost improvements, really they deal with the mostly center around the production operations here. And again, this is where you use that Kaizen budgeting here. So for your production operations, those involve the direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead. And the idea is here you want to reduce each of these. You want to reduce your material cost, your labor cost, and by doing that, you're also going to want to reduce your factory overhead cost. And by doing that, that affects the payments here. You'd be reducing the payments that you have to pay for the materials, labor, and your overhead. And by reducing those payments here, that affects your cash budget under your financial budget. You'd be reducing your cash budget amounts for the payments that you have to pay out here. So the key is here when we're dealing with this, the assumptions that have to be made here for the master budget. Normally, again, these amounts here would be fixed for your sales, your variable costs, your fixed costs, and sales mix, and so forth. But when cost improvements are included here, your sales prices can change. They don't have to be constant. Your variable costs on a per unit basis can be reduced here, and you're also looking to reduce your fixed costs. They're not constant. They can be reduced here. And your sales mix is not constant. That can change here. So with the master budget, those are what we're going to be looking at here. Okay, so just an overview of what we're really getting at here when we're talking about these cost reduction or these budgeted cost reductions or these cost improvements here. So looking at just a simple graph here where we have our cost here on our y-axis and our time here on our x-axis, or our time flow is increasing on our x-axis here, costs are increasing here on our y-axis. You're going to have some function here for your product costs here. And what you're doing here with your budgeted cost reduction, you're going to start with some actual cost in the previous year. And when we're talking about the function here, it's moving up and down here. The idea is your costs are moving down here on your product cost here over time. But you got some change here on your function relationship. So you start out with your actual cost from your previous year. You have some function here of that actual cost, and then you establish some current year cost base here. I'm showing that as our red amount here. And then by doing that, you're going to have some targeted reduction rate here. You got some constant rate here that you're targeting for your cost reductions. And you can see that's downward sloping here, so your costs would be decreasing here. And then as we move on through the year here, we're going to have some actual current year performance. It's moving up, it may be moving up and down and so forth, but you want to track it along this targeted reduction line here. You want to try to attain your current year performance based on your targeted reduction rate. And then you get to the end of the year here, you're going to have some targeted reduction amount here based on your targeted reduction rate. And then you would also have some actual reduction amount. I'm showing it as below our targeted rate here. So we actually would have achieved the greater cost reduction here based on our cost function that we're looking at here. But somehow you want to come up with a targeted reduction amount. You want to get in around this targeted rate here based on your targeted reduction rate. Okay, so that's basically what we're looking at here when we're talking about budgeted cost reductions, and we have to incorporate that into our budget, into our master budget, and then our operating budget underneath that, and then also into our financial budget. So we'll just be moving on here to look at some typical methods here for incorporating that into our direct materials, direct labor, and our factory overhead. So this targeted reduction rate here is really based on those amounts here, where they incorporated the reduction in your materials, your labor, and your overhead. Okay, so we'll continue on. Now we'll just be going over an example here to see how we'd incorporate those cost reduction ideas or our cost reduction into our direct labor, direct material, and overhead budgets. And again, these are based on budgeted estimates. And what you're going to have to do is, of course, start out with your sales budget. You want to know what your sales numbers are for each of the months of the years here. And you really establish here those material, labor, and overhead budgets on a monthly basis. But we'll just look at them on an overview here on a quarterly basis, how we deal with them. So first off, you're going to start out with your product cost here, and I've got it outlined here where you want to know your inputs here for your direct materials or direct labor, and then your factory overhead, both variable and fixed amounts. So what you're going to do here is you're going to establish your beginning of the year amounts here, what you have. So for direct materials, you're going to have some input amount here, and then you're going to have to determine your cost input to develop your cost output. And it's really taking, in this case, we just had looking at one unit here where it takes 2 parts per unit. Cost input is $10. So 2 times that gives us a cost output here at $20. So this is what we're really starting with here. But for the first quarter here, just looking at our direct materials, you want to establish some cost input amount here, and we reduced it from $10 to $9.80 here for one of those parts here. So 2 times that is going to give us cost output here for direct materials at $19.60. So this is how we're developing our cost outputs here based on those cost reductions that we want to incorporate into our budget here. So here we have gone from $20 down to $19.60 for direct materials for our first quarter. So we'd do the same here for our direct labor. We'd start out with some, in this case, standard or hours, 0.4 hours here to produce this product. Add some cost input here, $15 per hour. So that's going to give us a cost output here, 4/10 of an hour times $15 is going to give us a cost output of $6. So what we want to do here, we want to incorporate those, our quarterly budget or our targeted amounts here based on a quarterly basis, looking at our first quarter through our fourth quarter. So for our input here on hours here to produce this product, we're moving from 0.4 down to 0.395, and then we proceed down to 0.38 hours here for that particular product. But remember, this is just those cost reductions we want to incorporate on a quarterly basis. So we take those cost amount, or those labor hours here, the reduction in labor hours for each of those quarters times our cost input here. Say it's $15 per hour. So we're going to establish some cost output here. So in this case, for our first quarter, we're moving down from $6 for direct labor for the cost of that product down to $5.92, and then by the time we get down to the fourth quarter, we're sitting here at $5.70. Okay, so we're establishing our cost outputs here. And again, for a factory overhead, variable amounts, that's going to be based, in this case, based on some direct labor amounts that we have. So if we reduce our direct labor, then we can reduce our factory variable overhead here. So pulling those numbers off for our first quarter here for our labor, times our cost input here, $30 per hour. We've moved down here from $12 for this particular product down to $11.85 here for our variable overhead. So the same thing with our fixed overhead. You have, again, it's based on some direct labor hours, in this case, 4/10 of an hour. So our first quarter, we're going to move it down to what we have established here for our direct labor for our first quarter here at 3.395 hours here for that product times some cost input. In this case, it's $50 per hour here. That's going to give us some fixed overhead cost here of $19.75. So we had our amount here, $20 here for a fixed amount at the beginning of the period. So at the end of the first quarter, we want to get down to $19.75. So same for our variable. We had our fixed amount, or our variable amount here, beginning of the period at $12. So we got down to $11.85. So these are going to be our targeted amounts that we use here to determine our targets for our variable and our fixed overhead. So just looking at our total here without our cost reduction, just say at the beginning of the year, we're sitting here at $58. So that's where we had just taken our direct materials, direct labor, and our variable and fixed overheads. That was our total amount here without any cost reduction at this point, $58. So at the end of the first quarter, with our cost reductions totaling everything up for our labor, material, and overhead here, we're going to get down to $57.12. So that's how we'd be using these amounts and build it into our budgets here. So let's just go down here and look at our direct materials budget just for the first quarter here. So for our budgeted costs for direct materials, you're going to have some quantity times the cost here, quantity of parts times the number of dollars per part here. That's going to give you some amount here, and that, in this case, it's $223,100. So we take our new budgeted amount here for that first quarter here from $10 down to $980. We're going to come up with a new budgeted cost for direct materials here, moving down from $223,100 down to $218,638. So then for the budgeted cost, the direct material used, again, just go through the same numbers here. So you're going to have some beginning amount here. You're going to come up with some budgeted costs based on the beginning amount that you're working with, and then on with your cost reductions, you build that into it here, and you're going to come up with for the first quarter, you're going to have a new targeted amount here. So we moved down from $221,000 down to $216,580 based on those budgeted cost reductions for our direct material. Okay, so direct labor you'd have to handle in that way, direct materials in that way. So then moving up here to direct labor, go through the same thing. You have to know your direct labor hours needed for production, so you're going to have some production quantities coming off your production budget times the unit cost here in direct labor hours is going to give you the total amount here on your direct labor hours you need. In this case, we're sitting at 4,420 hours. So then each quarter here, we use that new labor, direct labor rate here. We had started at 0.4, and then we're moving it down to the fourth quarter at 0.38 hours here that we have here for the period. And then, of course, this has to be, you need it for each month. In this case, I'm just setting it off the month of March here that we're looking at. But you'd have to put in your numbers that you have to produce for each month. Take it times whatever you establish for your direct labor hours for the quarter, and then you're going to come up with the total direct labor hours you're going to need. So I'm sitting here at 4,420 at the beginning here, before established it here before the first quarter, at the beginning of the year here, and by the time I get down to the fourth quarter here, I'm sitting at direct labor hours we need at 4,199 hours. So now we can take those quarterly amounts here and we can determine our budgeted direct labor cost here based on our total direct labor hours here needed here on each basis. So you just put those and you just take your total direct labor hours here that you need times the direct labor rate here per hour, and you're going to come up with, we started out with some 66,300 here at the beginning of the year here, and then at each quarter here, again, this is based, remember I just based it on one month here, but you have to do it for each of the months here. I'm just showing it and demonstrating it based on the month here of March here that we had. So what you would do here based on those quarterly, those hours here, those reduction in direct labor hours for each of the quarters, you take them times, of course, times your labor rate here, and you're going to, we've gone down here from 66,300 we started out. So our targeted cost reduction that we'd have here for the budgeted direct labor costs is moved in the fourth quarter here based on our cost reduction here in direct labor hours. We're going to move down to $62,985 here. Okay, so that's pretty much how you handle your direct labor budget. So then moving down to the factory overhead budget, just looking at it for the first quarter here, you're going to have some fixed overhead cost here times your total standard hours budgeted. In this case, we had those amounts. You may want to even reduce your fixed overhead on a per hour basis here. You may want to reduce that. We're sitting here at $50, or you may want to reduce it down to $49.40 if you can. Time your standard hours here, and you're going to come up with a new for the first quarter here, you're going to have some new established targeted budgeted fixed overhead rate here. Move from $240,000 down to $237,120. So you do the same for your budgeted variable overhead costs. Start out with whatever you have for your variable overhead times the direct hours you need here, and let's come off our direct labor budget here that we had. So you have some established cost. In this case, you may even want to take your variable overhead here and move it down on a per hour basis if you can here. You may want to establish that, and then you would use those direct, and looking at the first quarter here, we move again down in our direct labor hours we needed here, and we taken that off our direct labor budget. So we had established here for our budgeted variable overhead cost at the beginning of the year here, $132,600. So at the end of the first quarter, we want to get down to $129,348 based on our new budgeted direct labor hours. And then budgeted factory overhead, same thing here. You want to come look at your first quarter overhead costs for your first quarter. Let's just say you had $372,600. So the first quarter overhead cost base, we want to move it down to $366,468. So you see what's going on here. You've had the beginning of the period rate here, and then for each quarter here, you've established some new rates based on your cost reductions. So when you get down here, so for a factory overhead, you're going to have some budgeted fixed overhead costs here. You're going to establish that based on your new estimates. Your variable overhead cost here, and then you're going to have some budgeted factory overhead fixed overhead costs you have here. So what you want to do is you want to get down to your cash payments for your overhead cost at the end of the year here. So you had some established amount that you began with, less any depreciation costs. So you come up with your new established amount that you have here for your total first quarter overhead rate, less your depreciation. Then you get down to your total factory overhead budgeted amount. So you started out with the beginning of the period amount, and then at the end of the first quarter you've established the new amount. So that's really what you're looking at here when you're trying to incorporate those cost reduction ideas into the various budget. And we just looked at it in terms of direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. But you would go through all your budgets in that fashion to determine whatever established rate you have for your cost reductions for each of those months or periods or quarters that you're looking at. Okay, so that'll summarize our topic.